Welcome to the Ex Post Facto Research Lecture. This is Arnold M. Duping, your today's lecturer. In this lecture, you will be learning all about the ex post facto research, its meaning and characteristic features. You will also learn about the differences between the ex post facto and the experimental research, and how to infer causal relationships. We will also learn about the strengths and weaknesses of this type of research. The ex post facto research is a kind of research in which the researcher predicts the possible causes behind an effect that has already occurred. For example, if child is delinquent, that is, one who indulges in criminal activities, then in order to find the basic reason behind such delinquency, the researcher will try to find out the various events that have occurred and the many possibilities that could have contributed to the concerned delinquent behavior. So the expected possibilities may be lack of discipline at school, family history, peer effects, neighborhood, or socialization. It is an interesting point to note that the researcher predicts a cause on the basis of a controlled effect, since no variation can be done on the effect which has already taken place on the basis of the independent variable or the cause. Thus, an ex post facto research can be defined as an empirically based investigation which does not involve the researcher's direct control over the independent variables, because they have already led to effects which can no more be manipulated. The conclusions regarding the relationships between the variables are inferred without intervening or varying the independent or the dependent variable. The term ex post facto, according to Landman in 1988, is used to refer to an experimental in which a researcher, instead of finding a treatment, examines the effect of a naturally occurring treatment after it has occurred. In other words, it is a study that attempts to discover the pre-existing causal conditions between groups. It should, however, be pointed out that the most danger of ex post facto research is the conclusion that because two factors go together, one is the cause and the other is the effect. Based on the concept of the ex post facto research, it is also known as causal comparative research. The ex post facto research has certain characteristics which distinguishes it from other different types of researchers. Now, let us discuss some of these characteristics. The first characteristic of ex post facto research is that it has a control or a comparison group. It means that, as the research is done on basis of the study of the cause, which has already led to its effects, it becomes necessary for the researcher to keep a control group, which can be used for comparison with the actual experimental group later on, in order to analyze the cause of an already occurred event. The next characteristic is that the behavior, the action, the event, or the treatment, or the independent variable of the research cannot be manipulated or changed by the researcher. As the ex post research is a kind of study which tries to predict the causes on the basis of actions that have already occurred, so the researcher can no longer manipulate or change the already occurred actions or behavior. The third characteristic of the research is that it focuses on the effects. Since the researcher tries to analyze and predict the reasons behind the occurrence of an event or phenomena, their first attempt is to focus on the event or the phenomena that has already occurred. Only after having a detailed study of the phenomena or the event The researcher tries to determine the causes behind such an event or phenomena. The next characteristic that we're going to discuss is that the research tries to analyze the how and what aspect of an event. Since the researcher tries to understand the causal effects behind a phenomena, the research basically focuses on how and what reasons that has led that phenomena to occur. And finally, the last characteristic would be the ex post facto research explore possible effects and causes. With the help of an ex post facto research, the researchers try to analyze the cause and effect phenomena of an event, action, or behavior. Again, this can be done only if we're going to use the ex post facto research. There is no doubt that both the experimental research and the ex post facto research try to investigate relationships between the existing variables. The conclusions of both are logically as well as empirically valid and reliable, yet there are certain basic differences between both of them. The first difference of experimental research and ex post facto research is the control over independent variable. In an experimental research, the researcher can directly manipulate the independent variable, which is the cause, in order to examine its effect on the dependent variable, which is the effect. On the other hand, in the ex post facto research, the researcher cannot directly manipulate the independent variable, which is the cause, as he or she predicts the cause on basis of the dependent variable, which is also considered as the effect. The next noted difference is the principle of randomization. The researcher can use the principle of randomization in an experimental research, while the researcher cannot use the principle of randomization in an ex post facto research because the researcher has no direct control over the cause, and so they infer the possibilities of the causes on basis of the existing effect. Unlike on the experimental, they can conclude or infer that other things remaining equal, constant, control the effect is a result of manipulation of the cause. The third cited difference is on the manipulation of variables. The researcher can manipulate variables in an experimental research. However, the researcher cannot manipulate variables in an ex post facto research. Finally, and I think this is the last difference between the experimental and the ex post facto research. This is the interpretation. In experimental research, it is easier to interpret or infer relationships between the dependent and the dependent variables, as they can manipulate the independent variable and see its effect on the dependent variable. While in the ex post facto research, it is difficult to interpret or infer relationship between the independent and the dependent variables, as there can be more than one possibilities or cause for a particular effect. The process of ex post facto research is systematic and follows a definite sequence. As mentioned by Isaac and Michael in 1971, the following are the steps involved in the ex post facto research. Step 1. Determining the problem. So in an ex post facto research, it is necessary for the researcher to focus on the problem that he or she needs to study. They not only need to find out the problem, they also need to determine, analyze, and define the problem which they will be dealing with. Step 2. Literature review. Before trying to predict the causal relationships, the researcher needs to study all the related or similar literature and relevant studies, which may help in further analysis prediction, and conclusion of the causal relationships between the variables under study. The third step is on the formulation of hypotheses. The third step of the ex post facto research is to propose the possible solutions or alternatives that might have led to the effect. They need to list out the assumptions, which will be the basis of the hypothesis and procedure of the research. The next step is on the designing the approach. Once the problem has been defined and the hypothesis has been postulated, the researcher needs to select the sample which fits the criteria of the study. They also need to select the scale or construct instrument for collecting the required information or the data. Once the designing are all finalized, the researcher analyzes the relationship between the variables. The next step, or step number 5, is on the validity of the research. The researcher needs to validate the significance of their research. They need to be cautious regarding the extent to which their findings would be valid and significant and helpful in interpreting and drawing inferences from the obtained result. Step number 6 is on the interpretation of the conclusion. Finally, the researcher needs to analyze, evaluate, and interpret the information collected. It is on the basis of this step only the researcher selects the best possible alternative of causes which might have led the effects to occur. Like Isaac and Michael, Jacobs in 1992 also proposed that the following steps in conducting the ex post facto research. According to Jacob, the first step is to state the problem. Following is the determination of the group to be investigated. Two groups of the population that differ with regard to the variable should be selected in a proportional manner for the test sample. The next step, or the third step, refers to the process of the collection of data. Techniques like questionnaires, interviews, literature search, etc. are used to collect the relevant information. And the fourth step, or the last step, in Jacob's step on the conduct of the ex post facto research is the interpretation of the findings and the results. So based on the conclusions, the hypothesis is either accepted or rejected. It must be remembered that even though the ex post facto research is a valid method for collecting information regarding an event that had already occurred, no research can be perfect in itself. All methods have their strengths as well as weaknesses. The same is applicable in the case of ex post facto research. This time, let's discuss the strengths and the weaknesses of the ex post facto research. The following are the strengths of the ex post facto research. First, it is considered as a very relevant method in those behavioral researches where the variables cannot be manipulated or altered. Second, the examples of such researches can include many sociological example on delinquency, as well as educational variables, example on achievements. Third, it is more useful than an experimental research as it can be used in analyzing a cause on basis of the effects, which is impossible in an experimental research. Fourth, it is less time-consuming as well as economical. Fifth, it gives a chance to the researcher to analyze on basis of this personal opinion and then come out with the best possible conclusion. However, there are also noted weaknesses as well as limitations of the ex post facto research, and these are the following. As discussed earlier, in an ex post facto research, the researcher cannot manipulate the independent variables. Second, the researcher cannot randomly assign the subjects to different groups. And finally, the researcher may not be able to provide a reasonable explanation for the relationship between the independent and dependent variables under study. Before we end this video lecture, please allow me to sum up what we have discussed. It can therefore be concluded that the ex post facto research holds a very good position in the field of behavioral sciences. It is the only method which is retrospective in nature. That is, with the help of this method, one can trace the history in order to analyze the cause, the reason or action from an effect, the behavior of an event that has already occurred. Although it is a very significant method, yet it has certain limitations as well. The researcher cannot manipulate the cause in order to see the alterations on its effect. This again marks a question on the validity of the findings of the research. Equally, the researcher cannot randomly assign the subjects into groups and has no control over the variables. Yet, it is one of the very useful methods as it has several implications in the field of applied research, as well as behavioral sciences. The investigator can predict the relationship between the variables on basis of an already existing output or effect.